He shut down hospitals like people close doors. But one clinic and one dying woman made him open one he didn't know he'd locked inside himself. The conference room on the 36th floor was made of glass and chrome, polished to a shine. That made it feel like a museum more than a place where decisions got made. Daniel Roth sat at the head of the table, his hands folded neatly, his watch catching the afternoon light. Outside, Manhattan stretched endlessly, indifferent to the man about to cut off access to care for hundreds. Daniel was a machine in these meetings, precise, strategic, emotionless. At 42, he was already being whispered about as the next Jeff Bezos of healthcare. If Bezos had a jawline sculpted from granite and a glare that shut down resistance faster than any memo, the Westbrook Community Clinic, he said, flipping open a file, has been running a deficit for 9 consecutive quarters. That's 2 years and change. Cost overruns, staff burnout, substandard equipment, and minimal private insurance reimbursements. You all know what that means. There was a hush. One of the analysts coughed. The regional director, Miriam Caro, cleared her throat. "Sir," she said carefully, "I understand the margins don't make sense, but Westbrook is a medically underserved area. The clinic's the only one within 40 miles. If we close it, they'll go somewhere else." Daniel cut in. "We're not running a charity. We're running a business, and the numbers don't lie." His words dropped like stones into the room. Flat, cold, irrefutable. No one spoke. Miriam hesitated, her eyes full of something Daniel didn't want to name. "We received a petition," she added quietly. "Over 700 signatures. The town council, I'm aware." "I've read it," he said, even though he hadn't. "We're still closing at 30-day notice. Draft the press statement." He stood up before anyone else could protest, closing his folder with a soft click that echoed like a door slamming shut. Back in his office, Daniel loosened his tie and sank into the leather chair. The skyline looked the same as always, breathtaking, distant, emotionless, just like him, except he wasn't sure why his hands were still clenched. That night, after the gym and a late dinner, alone in his penthouse, Daniel poured himself a glass of scotch and opened his laptop. Miriam had sent the local media coverage, even though she knew he rarely read anything not tied to a quarterly report. Still, something made him click. A photo loaded, faded blue paint on a low brick building, a hand-painted sign that read, "Westbrook Community Clinic, everyone welcome." Below it, a group of patients had gathered, holding up signs. One read, "This place saved my son." Daniel clicked out of the article. He had made the right call. Efficiency mattered more than sentiment. Business came first, always. That's what his father had taught him. Cold hands, colder rules. Emotion makes you weak. The words echoed like gospel in his mind, and yet, there was something about that sign. Everyone welcomed at everyone, even people who couldn't pay, even the ones the system forgot. He took another sip of scotch, trying to shake it off, but Westbrook wasn't done with Daniel Roth, and neither was fate. Before we dive deeper, tell us in the comments, do you believe business decisions should leave room for emotion, or does that only lead to failure? Hit subscribe, because this story isn't over yet, and it just might change your mind. 3 days after the closure order was issued, Daniel's executive assistant walked into his office holding a single envelope. No branding, no return address. "It came in the mail," she said, hesitating. "I thought you might want to read it." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "A letter, handwritten," she added. That alone made it unusual. Most of what crossed his desk was digital lawsuits, projections, reports, and the occasional complaint. A handwritten letter was ... nostalgic, maybe even suspicious. But for some reason, he took it. It wasn't long. The handwriting was neat, careful, the kind of script someone took time to form. "Dear Mr. Roth, I understand why you're closing our clinic. I really do. The numbers don't work, and it's not your job to fix what's broken in our town. But I wanted to ask something. Not for me, I'm terminal, and I've made peace with that. But for the others, for the ones who still have a shot at living, would you come see the clinic before it closes? Not for a press event, not with your nameplate. Just come and see it. The people, the hallway, the smell of the coffee machine, the way the nurses know everyone's name, just once. So when you sign the final paper, you'll know exactly what you're shutting down. Sincerely, Julia B." He read it twice. He should have tossed it. He should have smiled bitterly at the idea that a woman with terminal cancer thought she could guilt-trip a CEO. but something about it stayed. Maybe it was the calmness in her tone, not anger, not desperation, just humanity. Who gave this to you? He asked his assistant. It was forwarded from the clinic. Arrived with their last shipment of supply reimbursements. Daniel nodded, then dismissed her. That night, alone, in his high-rise apartment, the city glowing beneath him like circuitry, Daniel didn't answer emails, didn't call anyone. He just sat in the dark with a whiskey glass and Julia's letter. He had lived most of his adult life at a distance from people, from noise, from anything messy. His father had taught him early that vulnerability was dangerous, that the only way to survive the world was to outthink it, and never let your heart override your head. But now, a stranger from a town he couldn't place on a map was asking him to fly down and visit a dying place filled with dying people. What was the point? And yet, the next morning, without notifying anyone, he booked a one-way ticket to a town called Westbrook. He didn't wear a suit that day. He didn't bring a team or a photographer. He didn't even tell Miriam. Just jeans, a neutral sweater, and a baseball cap to keep himself invisible. He wanted to see it the way Julia saw it, unfiltered, uncurated. Westbrook was smaller than he expected, a main street with more closed shops than open ones, a diner, a faded library, a town square where teenagers lingered without purpose. The clinic sat at the edge of the street, low and square, with ivy creeping along its outer walls. The hand-painted sign Julia mentioned was real, everyone welcome. Inside, he found noise, but not chaos. The murmur of conversations, the shuffle of tired feet, and the occasional laugh drifting through the corridor. At the front desk, a young nurse looked up and smiled. "Hi there. First time?" Daniel nodded. "You checking in or just waiting?" He paused. "Just visiting." No one asked questions. He sat in the waiting area, observing. Children with runny noses clinging to their mothers, elderly men reading the local paper, a nurse handing out juice boxes. That's when he saw her, a woman by the window, her frame thin, skin pale, breathing through a tube, but her eyes were wide and warm, alive. She looked up, and without hesitation, she smiled. "You're him, aren't you?" she said softly, her voice dry but knowing. Daniel's throat tightened. "Who?" "The man who's closing this place." Daniel didn't answer her right away. Something about her voice, gentle, unafraid, almost amused, caught him off guard. Most people either bristled or bowed when they figured out who he was, but not her. She looked at him like she had seen him before, not in a magazine or a news segment, but in a more human way, like she could read straight through him. "I guess I am," he finally said, shifting awkwardly in the plastic chair beside hers. Julia turned back toward the window, the corner of her mouth lifting slightly. "I thought you'd be taller." He laughed despite himself. It came out more like a breath, surprised and uncertain. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, a mother was walking her toddler across the parking lot, holding the child's hand like it was something fragile and sacred. "I didn't expect you to come," Julia said after a long pause. "People like you rarely come back to the places they erase." Daniel looked down at his hands. "I didn't come back. I've never been here." "Then you came to see what you're destroying?" she asked, her voice still calm, almost curious. "I came to understand it," he said truthfully. "I don't know why, exactly. Your letter just stayed with me." Julia nodded slowly. "Funny, isn't it? How sometimes strangers can get under your skin more than people who've known you for years." He studied her. She looked delicate. Her skin had a paper-thin quality, and her oxygen tank made a soft hissing sound every few seconds. But she didn't seem frail. She sat with a kind of grounded dignity, as if even sickness had learned not to mess with her spirit. "What are you here for?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. She smiled. "You mean, what am I dying from, or what am I living for?" The question hit him like a wave. He blinked. Julia shrugged gently. "Stage 4 lung cancer. Non-smoker. It's in my bones now. I've got, maybe a few months, a little longer if I'm stubborn." Daniel swallowed hard. He had read about death plenty in risk assessments, in hospital reports, in headlines, but this was the first time he felt like he was sitting right next to it. "And what are you living for?" he asked softly. She turned to look at him fully this time. Her eyes were light gray, almost silver, and filled with something that startled him. "Peace. I live for Tuesdays," she said. That's when Miss Carroll bakes lemon cookies for the nurses. I live for when they play old Sinatra songs in the break room. I live for the way Dr. Abrams still greets every patient with their name even when the waiting room is packed. And I live for conversations like this, unexpected ones. Daniel didn't know what to say. Every part of his life was built around control, knowing the outcome before making the first move. But there was no playbook for this moment. No metric, no exit strategy. I don't talk much anymore, Julia added. But you look like someone who doesn't get listened to very often, despite all the noise around you. He looked away, startled at how accurate that felt. She reached into her bag, a worn canvas tote, and pulled out a small notebook. You don't have to believe in stories, Mr. Roth, but you're sitting in one right now. He took the notebook without thinking. On the cover was a sticker of a faded butterfly. Inside, pages were filled with small entries, quotes, doodles, memories, the names of patients who had passed, and little moments Julia had recorded. You're writing about the clinic. No, she said softly. I'm writing about what's worth remembering. For the first time in years, Daniel felt like he was being invited into a world that had no spreadsheets, no bottom lines, only meaning. That night, back at the motel on the edge of town, he sat on the bed with her notebook open on his lap. His phone buzzed non-stop. Updates from New York, investors checking in, Miriam's forwarded reports, but he ignored them. He read every single page, and when he reached the end, there was one final sentence, written in Julia's handwriting. I don't want to change your mind, Mr. Roth. I just want to remind you that you still have one. Daniel showed up again the next day. He didn't tell anyone he was coming. He didn't need an appointment. No one in Westbrook recognized him as the CEO of anything. Just another quiet man who sat near the windows, sometimes next to Julia, sometimes alone. But the staff started noticing, not who he was, but that he was watching, really watching. Sat in the hallway one morning while a nurse wheeled in a young man with cerebral palsy. The nurse spoke gently to him, adjusting the angle of the chair so he could see the TV playing cartoons. The young man laughed, a soft, fluttering sound. That filled the room with warmth, and Daniel felt something stir in him. He saw a woman in her 60s knitting in the waiting area. Not for herself, but for babies she said she'd never meet. I just bring these to the maternity clinic up north, she told the receptionist. For the new little ones. The world's already hard. Might as well wrap them in something soft. He heard laughter coming from the lab. Of all places, two techs trying to outpun each other over blood test results. There was no sterile, emotionless distance here. These people joked, comforted, touched, remembered, and Julia was always near the window, sometimes asleep, sometimes watching, but always present. They talked every day now. On his third visit, she asked, "Do you ever feel like your life got too loud for you to hear your own thoughts?" He nodded before realizing he'd never said that aloud, not even to himself. "I used to think silence meant emptiness," he replied. "Now I think maybe it's the only place something real can grow." Julia smiled at that. Maybe that's why dying slows everything down, so we can finally hear what matters. That day, she asked him to walk with her, wheel her through the clinic, just down the hallway, past the exam rooms, and toward the back, where the small community room sat. It was nothing more than a repurposed storage space. 2 couches, mismatched chairs, and a bookshelf full of donated novels, but it buzzed with quiet joy. A teenage girl with a scarf around her bald head was helping an old man read large print poetry. A single father sat at the corner table filling out job applications while a nurse watched over his sleeping baby. In one corner, someone had set up a tiny box of colored pencils and crayons, and 2 kids were drawing together, one of them with a bandage around his chest, the other in a wheelchair. Julia gestured toward the scene with a faint sweep of her hand. "They don't teach this in med school, or in boardrooms." "This," she exhaled softly, "this is medicine too." Daniel didn't reply, but something in him cracked. Later that evening, after he walked Julia back to her chair by the window, she looked at him and said, "You know what's strange? You seem like someone who doesn't want to be the person everyone thinks you are." He hesitated. "And who do you think I am?" She smiled. "Someone who forgot he was a boy once. A boy who might have dreamed of being something other than a CEO." He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. But that night, he dreamt of his childhood, of the backyard where his mother used to plant marigolds, of sitting on the front porch waiting for a father who rarely came home. When he woke up, he remembered the smell of those marigolds. He hadn't remembered that in years. He spent the rest of that morning walking the edges of the town. He passed the shuttered post office, the rusting gas station, the park with swings that creaked in the wind. Westbrook wasn't a place investors would ever call promising, but it had a heartbeat, and every beat echoed inside the clinic. He was scheduled to shut down in just under 3 weeks. His phone rang. It was Miriam. "You've been offline. The board's asking if you're okay." "I'm fine," Daniel said, but the words sounded unfamiliar. She hesitated. "They want to move forward with the PR release next week. Shall I prepare a statement?" Daniel stared out at the street, at a boy riding his bike down the cracked sidewalk, at a teenager holding the door open for an elderly woman with a cane. "Not yet," he replied, and for the first time in his adult life, he didn't feel the need to justify his delay. Daniel wasn't sure why he kept coming back. He had no strategy for this place, no executive agenda, but each time he stepped into the Westbrook clinic, the noise in his mind dulled just enough for him to breathe. And then came the girl with the silver bracelet. She was maybe 7, small for her age, with a head of dark curls and shoes too big for her feet. She didn't cry or speak, just clung to her grandmother's hand while they waited in the corridor. Daniel noticed her bracelet first, not because it was shiny, but because it was engraved. He only saw it when she reached for a tissue from the counter, and the sleeve of her sweater pulled back. It read, "Emma Rayner, severe allergy. Code 8209. He didn't know what the code meant, but he recognized the precaution, the silent fear that lived inside families like hers. A bracelet that said, "Please read this before you inject anything, before it's too late." Emma's grandmother was holding a paper bag of medication samples. Her hands shook as she tried to sort through it. A nurse came over, offering to help, and they began discussing what was covered and what wasn't. Daniel overheard words like partial assistance, not eligible, and requires private insurance. He didn't mean to listen, but then Emma looked up at him. No words, just a gaze that said, "I know you're watching." He crouched down to her level. "Is that bracelet special to you?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Does it make you feel safe?" Another nod, and then, finally, a whisper. "It tells people not to make me sick." He swallowed. That night, he found himself sitting alone on the bench outside the clinic, long after the sun had gone down. He scrolled through reports, past emails, budget lines, and finally, into a folder labeled Westbrook Phaseout. His thumb hovered over the file. He opened it, read the summary dot, and there it was in cold print. Projected savings from closure. $2.1 million annually recommended reallocation. Metropolitan growth. Projects Tier 1 priority. Community impact, minimal. Clinic services considered non-essential. Daniel stared at that last line. Minimal. He thought of Julia, of the old man reading poetry, of the girl with the silver bracelet. He thought of rooms full of breathing, not profits, not projections, just breathing. The wind picked up. He tucked his coat tighter and leaned back. For the first time, he wondered, what if keeping this place open wasn't a loss? What if it was the first thing I've done in years that actually mattered? The next morning, he brought coffee for the front desk staff. No fanfare, just a quiet thank you. He asked if Emma was scheduled again soon. The nurse looked surprised, then smiled. "You remembered her name." "I try to remember what matters," Daniel replied. That day, he sat with Julia again. She was paler now, her voice softer, but her presence no less bright. "I saw a little girl here yesterday," he told her. "Emma?" she asked. "Yeah, she's strong. She doesn't speak much." Julia smiled. "She doesn't have to. Some people say more with a look than others do with a speech." He nodded. "She reminded me of someone who my daughter." It was the first time he'd mentioned her, even to himself. He didn't elaborate. Julia didn't press. Instead, she simply said, "Then I'm glad you saw her." They sat in silence after that, but it was the kind of silence that carried meaning. Like a full room. Like breathing. If this story has stirred something in you, maybe a memory, or just a feeling you can't explain, leave a comment and share it. Your voice might be what someone else needs to hear today. Daniel stood outside his office window, staring down at the city he once thought he'd conquer. But lately, all he could see was the quiet neighborhood clinic tucked into a forgotten corner. The place that had somehow become more real to him than the view from the 40th floor. A letter sat unopened on his desk. It had been forwarded from legal, a formal notice about the Westbrook Clinic's impending closure. It required only his signature now. He didn't touch it. Instead, he turned to the photo frame buried behind paperweights and awards. It was the only one he had left of him and his father, taken in a hospital waiting room decades ago. He was maybe 10. His father looked young and healthy, though Daniel remembered that day as the last time they ever went to the hospital together. His father had vanished from his life. Not long after that, he never fully understood why, until now. Daniel returned to the clinic later that week, under the guise of an internal audit, but no one bought it, especially not Julia. She was waiting in the lounge, a blanket over her lap and a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. "Twice in 1 week," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Did your board approve that?" He smiled faintly. "Let's say, I'm running my own numbers these days." Julia patted the seat next to her. "Then sit, there's something I want to show you." She handed him a small, worn notebook, the cover peeling, the spine broken. "I write letters," she explained, "to people I've lost, to myself, to people I wish I'd met. It keeps me from going numb." He flipped through a few pages. Her handwriting was crooked but elegant, full of scratched-out words and last-minute revisions. Some letters were to a sister, some to an old lover, some to a future version of herself, and then he stopped. There was one labeled simply, "To the man upstairs." "God?" he asked. "No," she said softly. "The CEO." He looked up. "I wrote it before I knew who you were. When I thought no one cared, I never meant to send it, but I want you to read it now." He hesitated, then began. "You don't know me, and that's fine. I've stopped expecting people like you to see people like me. But if you ever do walk through these doors, if you ever pause long enough to look past your spreadsheets, you'll see that this place isn't broken. It's breathing. It's fragile and it's flawed, and some days it feels held together by nothing but hope. But it matters. It matters more than you know." He stopped reading halfway. "Why didn't you send it?" he asked quietly. "I thought it wouldn't matter," she said. "But maybe ... maybe it does." Daniel closed the notebook, and in that moment, something broke loose in him, not like a dam bursting, but like a slow thaw. Years of armor, cracking just enough to let something soft pass through. He glanced at his watch, then back at Julia. "Can I borrow this? Only if you promise not to rewrite it. I won't change a word." That night, in his apartment, he did something he hadn't done in years. He wrote a letter, but not to a board member or attorney, to his father. It wasn't angry. It wasn't pleading. It was simply honest. "I used to think you left because you didn't care. But now I wonder. Maybe you just didn't know how to stay. I don't either, but I'm trying." He didn't know what he'd do with it yet. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like running. It had been 2 weeks since Daniel last touched a financial report. 2 weeks since he'd been in a meeting, worn a suit, or sat in the glass conference room that used to define his entire existence. Instead, he now carried 2 notebooks, Julia's and his own. Julia called them the books that breathe. And slowly, Daniel found himself writing more. Thoughts, questions, fragments of memory, things he hadn't allowed himself to say out loud for decades. Back at Westbrook, the receptionist had started saving him a seat by the window. He never asked for it, but it was always there, with a fresh cup of tea waiting, and a post-it note with his name scribbled in blue ink. A small gesture, but it stayed with him. One morning, he noticed the clinic was busier than usual. More patients, more noise, more tired parents with clipboards and toddlers in tow. "What's going on today?" he asked a nurse, and "Overflow," she replied. "People ration meds all month, then flood in before it's too late." He stared at the line that curled through the hallway. There were no TV cameras, no headlines, no tweets trending about it. Just real people doing their best to survive. Daniel watched a man hand over his last $20 bill for antibiotics. No complaint, just quiet resignation. A teenage boy tried to act tough as he clutched his fractured wrist. His mother sat beside him, holding his backpack like it was the only thing holding them together. And in one corner, Emma, the girl with the silver bracelet, sat reading a picture book out loud to another child. That image did something to him. He stepped outside to breathe. Julia found him leaning against the brick wall, notebook in hand, eyes closed. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded, then corrected himself. "No, but maybe that's the point." She smiled softly. "You're learning." He looked at her. "How do you keep doing this, day after day, knowing what's coming?" Julia tilted her head. You mean, how do I sit in a place filled with pain and not let it crush me? He nodded. I don't avoid the pain, she said. I just let it move through me, like a wave. Some days it knocks me down. Some days I float. Daniel didn't reply, but her words clung to him. Later that evening, back at his apartment, he received a call from Miriam. I heard you've been involved at Westbrook. I've been visiting, he said plainly. The board wants a decision. If we're shutting it down, we need to start reallocating funding by the end of the quarter. Daniel took a long breath. He looked at Julia's notebook sitting on the table, then at his own, now half full with scribbled thoughts he never thought he'd let exist. I need a little more time, he said. Miriam paused. They won't wait forever. I'm not asking for forever. Just until I know I'm making the right decision, not just the safe one. When he hung up, he flipped open his notebook and wrote, some numbers can be measured. Profit, loss, growth, but others, others you feel. Warmth in a waiting room, the strength in a child's stare, the silence after someone dies. These aren't assets or liabilities. They're the breath between the math. He visited the clinic again the next morning. Julia was weaker that day. Her hands trembled more. Her smile faded faster, but she still managed to whisper when he sat beside her. You're different now, she said. He shook his head. I'm not sure I've changed. No, she said, but you've started remembering who you were before all of this. Daniel didn't say it, but he knew what she meant. The boy who used to sit with marigolds before the world got hard. The son who waited too long for a father who never came. The man who buried himself in power to avoid his own pain. Maybe that man was fading, or maybe, just maybe, he was learning how to feel again. 3 days later, Julia stopped answering her phone. Daniel had called twice, then texted, then walked the now familiar route to Westbrook on foot, as if hurrying might change the outcome. When he arrived, the front desk nurse didn't have to say anything. Her eyes did the talking. He found Julia in her usual room, but this time she didn't smile. She was asleep. Shallow breaths, pale skin, fingers curled loosely around the edge of her blanket, like she was holding on to something invisible. The doctor pulled Daniel aside. Her vitals dropped last night. We've stabilized her, but we're close. Daniel's throat tightened. She's alone. She refused to call family. The doctor said she already had who she needed. Daniel stepped back, inside, and took the chair by her bedside. His hands shook. He whispered her name. Her eyes fluttered just enough to see him. A flicker of peace passed over her lips. You came, she rasped. I always come back, he said, voice cracking. Julia gave the tiniest nod. Then listen. She reached under her blanket and pressed something into his palm. A small envelope, cream-colored, handwritten. Open it when it's time. He looked at it like it burned. Julia exhaled deeply. I'm not afraid. I just want you to remember something. What? That healing doesn't mean forgetting what hurt. It means choosing love anyway. Daniel blinked hard. I wanted to change you, she said weakly. But I think you changed yourself. He sat with her until nightfall. He told her things he'd never said to anyone. About the first time he lied to feel powerful. About his father's silence. About the meeting rooms filled with applause but no warmth. And he thanked her, not just for seeing him, but for staying by morning. She was gone. Daniel didn't cry at first, not in the room, not when the nurse gently took her pulse and nodded with trembling fingers, not when they wheeled the bed away. He waited until he was alone in the stairwell, where the smell of disinfectant clung to concrete, and the sound of life moving on echoed below. Then he broke. A quiet, shaking grief that didn't ask for permission, the kind that didn't need anyone watching. When he finally returned to his apartment, he opened the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded once. Daniel, you won't save the world, but you might save a girl with a silver bracelet, or a father afraid to stay, or even a man too proud to cry. That's enough. Don't count the lives you save. Feel them. Love, Julia. He stared at her handwriting for a long time. Not just the words, but the way the ink wobbled in the last line, as if she'd known time was running short. He folded it back and placed it inside the front page of her notebook, which now felt less like hers, and more like something he was being asked to carry forward. Daniel didn't return to work the next day, or the day after that. Instead, he returned to Westbrook, not as a visitor, but as someone who finally understood what staying meant. He started helping organize supplies, paid anonymously for Emma's therapy sessions, sat quietly with patients who had no family. No one called him CEO anymore, just Daniel, and he realized he preferred it that way. 2 weeks after Julia's passing, Daniel stood in front of the Westbrook Board of Directors, but not as their CEO. He had called the meeting himself. No tie, no suit, just a soft grey sweater and eyes that had seen too much and still weren't done seeing. "Thank you for coming," he began, voice calm but steady. "I'm not here to talk about profit or expansion or mergers." Some of the members shifted in their seats. "I'm here because I owe someone and myself the truth." A few raised eyebrows. One coughed nervously. Daniel continued. 3 months ago, I tried to buy this hospital, not to save it, not to help anyone, but because I thought I could fix what was broken by owning it. Julia changed that." He paused, not just by being a patient, but by refusing to be invisible. He pulled a folder from his bag and passed it to the chairperson. "In there is a proposal. It's not for a merger, it's for a foundation." He looked around the table. "Named after her." Silence, he explained. The Julia Foundation would cover medical costs for terminal patients without family. It would fund mental health support for long-term inpatients. It would give nurses the overtime they deserved and volunteers the training they needed. "I'll fund the first 2 years myself," Daniel said. "After that, I ask for your partnership, not your signatures, but your presence." The chairwoman opened the folder slowly, scanned a few pages, then looked up. "Are you sure about this?" Daniel smiled for the first time that morning, more than I've ever been about anything. That afternoon, he returned to room 314, Julia's old room. It had been cleaned out. A new patient had already moved in, an elderly man with Parkinson's, who greeted Daniel with a confused smile. Daniel didn't explain why he was there. He just asked if he could sit, and the man nodded like he understood anyway. That night, Daniel wrote in Julia's old notebook, not as a message to her, but as a letter to himself. Healing isn't a straight line. Sometimes it's a folded piece of paper. Sometimes it's a chair next to a stranger. Sometimes it's a life that ended too soon, so another could begin. He closed the notebook, but the pages felt warm, like they still held breath. Elsewhere in the city, a mother and daughter walked into Westbrook for the first time. The girl wore a silver bracelet. She was missing hair but not hope. The nurse handed them a folder. "This one's on the Julia Foundation," she said gently. The mother didn't know who Julia was, but as she turned the corner and saw a photo on the wall, a woman with a shaved head, laughing mid-sentence, framed under the words "Choose love anyway," she felt like she did. Daniel returned to his apartment late. He didn't turn on the lights, he just stood by the window, overlooking the city skyline that once felt like a fortress and now just looked human. He thought of his father, of the silence that shaped him, and of the hospital basement where everything began, not with a deal, but with a goodbye. He didn't need the company's applause anymore. Just one voice, the one he'd almost ignored, that still echoed softly in his chest. "You won't save the world, but you might save one." 6 months passed. The Julia Foundation was no longer a proposal in a folder. It had a staff, a wing, a plaque on the 3rd floor that simply read, "For those who stayed, and those who stayed behind." Daniel didn't return to the boardroom. Not because he wasn't welcome, but because he finally understood that healing didn't need a title that he volunteered on. Wednesdays. Not as a CEO, just as Daniel. Sometimes he brought books to kids. Other times, he just sat beside a patient too tired to talk and held their hand while machines beeped gently in the background. And sometimes, he found himself back in the basement ward. The hospital had decided not to tear it down. Instead, they turned it into a sanctuary, a small library, a quiet place. Daniel had donated his father's books, the only things left from that dark room, but not the chair. That stayed exactly where it was, worn, slightly tilted, still facing the window. The staff joked about it sometimes, that no one could move it even if they tried. It was like the past had anchored itself there. Daniel never corrected them. He knew it wasn't the past that was anchored, it was Grace. One afternoon, as he packed up after his volunteer shift, a nurse ran up to him in the hallway. "Mr. Cross," she called out, breathless. "There's a patient asking for you." He blinked. "I'm not staff." "She didn't ask for a doctor," the nurse interrupted. "She asked for you by name." Room 507. Daniel walked in slowly. A woman sat up in bed, her eyes sunken, her breath shallow, but her voice still had an edge of warmth. "I've seen you on the foundation posters," she said. Danielle smiled. "That's not my best angle." She chuckled weakly. "I don't care about your angle. I care that you came." He sat beside her. They talked, not about illness or regrets, but about stories. She'd read about Julia, knew about the chair in the basement, about the little girl whose life had been saved by a whisper and a silver bracelet. She looked at Daniel and asked, "Do you ever feel like everything had to fall apart, just so the right pieces could find each other?" He thought about it, about the boy he was, the man he became, the father who never said goodbye, and the girl who taught him how. He nodded. "Yes," he said, "I do." That night, Daniel walked back through the city. It rained softly. People hurried past him with umbrellas and headphones, but he slowed down, feeling each drop like a memory. He stopped by a florist, bought a single sunflower, walked 2 more blocks, and left it on a doorstep, one he hadn't visited since before the basement, the room, the deal that never mattered. No note, no message, just a quiet offering to someone who once believed in him, long before he believed in himself. He didn't wait for the door to open, didn't need it to. Some windows, once opened, never really closed, and somewhere in the hospital, a girl smiled in a photo, not because she was winning, but because she had made peace with losing, and in doing so, she taught a man how to live.